Well, happy Wednesday, everybody. I hope you're doing well. I do pray that you're staying healthy, staying safe, and staying sane as well. Speaking of sane, there is a very large fly flying around my office. So if you see me swatting, I'm not losing my mind. I'm just swatting at a fly. But thanks for joining me. I think this is pretty sure this is the fourth of these Bible studies through YouTube on When in Rome, Romans 12 through 16. And just by way of a maybe 30-second recap, we've worked our way through Romans chapter 12 already. Romans 12 is Paul's transition out of this deeply theological section of Romans 1 through 11, where he's really explaining the gospel in great detail. And Romans 12 begins his application of the gospel. If this is true, this then is how you live, when in Rome. And part of that is we renew our minds. We have our minds renewed, and we can now approve of what God's will is. We seek to lay our lives down as living sacrifices before the Lord. And then he goes on to explain what that's going to look like, kind of where the rubber meets the road, in different spheres of our relationships. First, it was our relationship with ourselves, where we ought not to think of ourselves too highly. Then our relationship to the church and how we use our spiritual gifts in the body, the local body of the church. And then more broadly, how do we relate to our fellow believers, our spiritual family? And then wider yet, how do we relate to the non-Christian community, those outside the fellowship of the saints? That brings us up to Romans chapter 13, which is kind of a chapter I've been looking forward to and dreading at the same time, because Paul begins a discussion about how we relate to the state. And that has been a touchy, difficult, sometimes sore topic of discussion for the church through many centuries. And we'll wade into that a little bit today. Before we kind of dive in and look at the text, I think it's maybe helpful to keep in mind 4 different models that the church has operated with as it relates to church and state through the centuries. One of the first models, not the first to develop, but in my way of presenting, the first model is a model where the state controls the church. Erastinianism is often how that is referred to, and if you want a model of what that looks like, you could look at, for example, the Anglican Church in England, where it is Parliament that adopted the Book of Common Prayer, and the state is appointing bishops and archbishops and things like that. So the state is over the church. Kind of the flip side of that would be a theocracy, where the church controls the state. And the best example of that would certainly be ancient Israel, which was a pure theocracy. And you do see some examples of that throughout history. Maybe Puritan New England would be an example, more contemporary example of that. Constantinianism is a kind of midway point between the two, a bit of a compromise where the state favors the church, and the church accommodates, I would say sometimes sinfully accommodates the state so that it can maintain its position of favor with the state. The fourth model is sometimes referred to as a partnership model or a two-kingdom approach to church and state that recognizes the church and the state both have God-given roles and ought to partner, respecting each other's unique realms of authority, but also respecting that they each have God-given roles to play in God's work here on earth. Romans chapter 13, if you take it all by itself, I think would lead you to naturally conclude that Erastinianism model, where the state is over the church. But Romans 13 isn't the only chapter on this that we have in the Bible. And if you take the whole of the Bible together, I think probably that two kingdoms model is the best. But as we walk through Romans chapter 13, we'll engage with that a little bit more fully, but not too fully. because it's a big, big, big topic for sure. The emphasis in Romans 13 isn't on these grand theories of church and state, but really it's about how do I as a believer interact with and relate to the state, even a pagan state like Rome. So the emphasis is on personal relationship to the state. And Paul must have felt that there was a reason he needed to address this. Now, Romans isn't a systematic theology that he wrote in a vacuum. It's an occasional letter written to Rome to address certain issues, misunderstandings of the gospel, misunderstandings of, well, maybe how they relate to the state. So Paul felt he needed to address this and, in essence, warn believers against getting involved with revolutionary movements against Rome, against the state. It does have application for things like crime, but really it's more about revolutionary movements against Rome or against the state more in general. And there was a need to address that. Jews had quite a long history of revolting against oppressive regimes that were over them. The Seleucids, and you have the Maccabean revolt in, I don't know my dates on that one, I think around 160 BC. And then there was smaller revolts against Rome leading up to a very large revolt in the 66 AD that would lead to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So there was this, the Jewish state, the Jewish people were oppressed and often rose up in revolt against their oppressors. Add to that, fairly frequent uprisings in Rome as lower classes would riot against the upper classes and they would be squashed as a result. And add to that mix the possibility that the Jews who had been expelled from Rome under Claudius were now beginning to return back to Rome and probably harbored some kind of deep hostility towards the state. So Paul is wise in addressing this issue because there's a lot of backstory here and a lot of potential for real troubles. And so Paul is stepping into this not debate, because he's not debating this. He's laying down instructions for the church. So why don't we look at what Paul has to say. This is chapter 13, starting in verse 1. Paul says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is let me try and get that one right. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Verse 2. "Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur," and I cut that off, "wrath," or judgment. I don't know why I cut that off. My bad. I'm sorry about that. But verse 1 here comes with a command and then an explanation for the command. The command is be subject to the governing authorities. I think it is interesting that Paul doesn't use the word obey. Obey is more specific, kind of a stronger word, but be in submission to, be subject to, which is a broader word, and it certainly has overlap with the word obey, but they're not synonyms. I think that's an important distinction because there are times where a Christian may be forced to not obey, but still ought to have that attitude of submission and being subject to, being submissive. So if we're forced to not obey because of conscience and what God has directed, we will still submissively accept the consequences of our refusal to obey. And I think you see that kind of thing playing out, when Peter is arrested for preaching the gospel and he says, "I'm going to keep preaching the gospel, and what happens, happens." One of my dad's favorite sayings growing up, he had a lot of them, was "do what's right and let the chips fall where they may." If you disobey, accept the consequences that are going to come your way. And I think that's the attitude that is behind what Paul is suggesting here. Be subject to, be submissive. Yes, be obedient as far as you can which goes back to Romans chapter 12, as far as it's possible, live at peace with others. We're to be subject to the governing authorities. That phrase is interesting and has caused quite a bit of debate through the last century, when Oscar Coleman pointed out and articulated that this is maybe a reference to spiritual authorities that are behind and animate worldly authorities. And Christ, having won the victory over spiritual authorities, they are now subject to him, and so we ought to be subject to them. Possible, I guess. But I think context here makes it really, really clear that we're talking here about earthly authorities, governors, magistrates, princes, kings, who do wield, this will come in verse 4, the power of the sword. And they've been established by God, which is the reason for the command. The command is be subject to the governing authorities, and the reason behind that is because they have been established by God. No authority, Paul says, exists except that has come from God. He is the source of all authority, so if someone has it, it's come from God. Those that exist have been established of God or by God. That's true of Rome. It was true of Britain. It's true even of Satan and his authority, which he does have, but what authority he has been granted to him. Think, for example, of the story of Job. Think also of Jesus before Pilate. Pilate held Jesus' life in his hands and had the power to set him free or the power to crucify him. But Jesus says, you have no authority over me unless it had been given to you. He understands that Pilate's authority is a delegated authority. He has it from God. I think there is a distinction that needs to be made between authorities delegated to institutions, kings, magistrates, princes, governors, presidents, and individuals. Paul here is talking about institutions, not necessarily individuals. And I think we can say more about that in a minute. Feel free to live chat me a question on that if you have one. Paul is saying that these institutions, these governing authorities, have been established by God. So that's verse 1. Verse 2 explains the implications of that and the consequences of it. The implication is, if you resist the authorities, you are resisting God. You're rebelling against something he has established. And the consequence is you will incur, and again, I cut that word out on accident, judgment. The word judgment can have a double meaning there. You're going to incur the judgment of those authorities, the temporal judgment of those authorities that God has established, with imprisonment, possibly even death. And there's an element where you'll experience, or you have to fear, God's judgment. Now, the King James actually translates that as damnation. And I think that's probably a little bit too strong a translation there. But it's possible that that's what Paul intended. I don't think so. Okay, we can maybe pause there and just acknowledge that this passage raises a lot of questions. I want to press on through verses 3 and 4 before we try to address those questions. Okay? So verse 3, Paul says, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is a servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. I find it really, really interesting that the word servant there is diakonos, which we translate when we're in relationship to the church, servant or deacon. It's the same word. And so the deacon in the church corresponds in a way to the servant, the magistrate, those who have governing authority in the state. Both administrate an element of God's will, of how he governs in his world. These two verses combined with verses 1 and 2 are incredibly difficult because they seem to make no allowance for evil governors, right? A governor or a magistrate who would approve of what's evil and condemn what is good. Paul doesn't make an allowance or exceptions for that here in Romans chapter 13. And I think there's two different ways that we could legitimately, truthfully deal with that. The first is to say that this is the norm, but there are exceptions. And if the state deviates from this norm, then they're no longer exercising the authority in a God-ordained way. And they are no longer owed our allegiance, our obedience, our submission. So there's the way of interpreting this where it's the norm, but with exceptions that aren't articulated in this chapter. It would be kind of like another example of a norm, a universal being articulated without exceptions, even though there are exceptions, would be when Paul says, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." Well, I know one who hasn't sinned, and his name was Jesus. It's the norm, it's the universal, but there are exceptions. Or when Paul says, "All die." Well, there was exceptions to that. That's the universal claim, the universal truth, but there were exceptions with Elijah and Enoch, for example. So, in general, the state exists to punish evil and to reward good, but there are exceptions. That's one way of handling this dilemma, this challenge. Another way is saying that God uses even the evil of the state to bring about his ultimate good, and that we ought not resist or we ought to still be submissive as far as we can to an evil state. It seems to be more of Augustine's approach. Augustine says that God ordains even wicked, evil, oppressive rulers, princes, Caesars, when the people deserve it. It's his way of punishing a people. I think there's a truth in both of them, but I think what Paul is really describing here is the norm and not articulating the exceptions, though they do exist. Paul's not meaning to suggest that all Neros and all Stalins are good, but that the state has been put in place for a reason. There are governing institutions that are God-ordained and serve a purpose. Yet, often, because of the universal language that Paul uses here, this chapter has been used by tyrants to demand the church's loyalty to even tyrants. Pretty interesting example that I read about this week on that is Michael Cassidy. Michael Cassidy is a South African pastor, evangelist, writer, activist, and he's the founder of the African Enterprise. Back in 1985, he was given an opportunity to meet with then President Botha. I'm not exactly sure if I'm saying that right. But he had hoped that this meeting with the South African president would be one where they could talk about the sin of apartheid, and hopefully, maybe naively, he was prayerful that it would lead to repentance for this national sin. He says that he knew right away going in as the meeting started that that's not the way this meeting was going to go, because the president stood up and began reading Romans chapter 13, basically demanding that this pastor submit to this sinful institution and require his parishioners and those he taught to submit to it as well. Total misuse of Romans chapter 13, but the way Romans chapter 13 has been used often. Christians, we are called to be submissive and to obey up until the point where disobedience is required. And here's where I suggest in the very beginning that we need to take the whole of the biblical witness, because there's plenty of examples when the people of God obeyed to a point and then were forced to, by conscience and by knowing God's will, disobey. You can go back to ancient Israel in Egypt when the midwives were commanded to kill all the baby boys, and they disobeyed that order. You could look in Israel in exile when Nebuchadnezzar ordered them to bow down before the statue and worship the statue, and the few faithful refused to obey that. Or Daniel, who refused to obey the order of King Darius not to pray to any god but him. You could go to the disciples, right? The apostles, who continued to preach even though they were commanded not to. Where the state demands more of us than we can give, or requires of us evil, then we are obligated to resist in that way. I've said a lot about what Paul doesn't mean. He doesn't mean that all rulers and all rules are good. He doesn't mean that there's never a time, it's a double negative, I know that. He doesn't mean there's never a time when they should be resisted. But he does mean that the state has God-given authority and a legitimate role. And that's where I think we come back to this two kingdoms idea. Christ rules over everything. But there's two kingdoms, a secular kingdom and a spiritual kingdom, and he rules over those differently and to different goals. He rules over the secular kingdom through magistrates, through governors, through laws enacted by legislatures. And he does that to provide order and stability. It's an expression of common grace to his world. The spiritual kingdom is a redemptive kingdom. It's where we experience the grace of salvation. And God rules in the spiritual kingdom through the church and its structures, elders, presbyteries, bishops, pastors, deacons. And the power of the secular kingdom is the sword. The power of the spiritual kingdom is, at best, the metaphorical sword of church discipline, excommunication, and its true power is in the word and sacrament. So the secular kingdom and the spiritual kingdom, Christ rules over both of them, but he does it differently and to different ends. But they both play an important role. And submitting to the secular authorities is submitting to Christ's rule through them. Interesting, I think this passage here, especially verses 3 and 4, does imply that the state can discern what is good and what is evil. Remember who Paul is writing about here. This is Rome, right? They're not looking to Scripture to determine what is right and wrong. They're not looking to Old Testament ethical codes given to Moses or to the apostles' teaching in Scripture to determine what's right and wrong. But Paul's acknowledging that they do know these things because of God's common grace and what we can discern from his witness that he's left in creation and in our consciences, something called natural law. And there's a basis in natural law for even states who are not Christian to know what is good and what is evil, and to reward what is good and to punish what is evil. And the state does bear the sword and is God's appointed servant to punish the evil, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. We don't carry out wrath, but the institutions that God has ordained do. I think that brings us back to the question we raised last week. Is pacifism required of a Christian? Can a Christian serve as a judge where they're going to hand down judgment, hand down a sentence? Can they serve in the military? Can they serve as a police officer? I think based on Romans 13, the answer is yes, they can. It's legitimate use of force that is God ordained. They've been given the power of the sword to use in service to the good. And I think that is true of a Christian. A Christian can serve God as a vocation in those fields, bearing the sword and avenging on behalf of God, not a personal injustice. I am not at liberty to go out and avenge myself. But a state actor does establish justice and mete out punishment. So the members of the community, kind of in summary of these few verses here, the members of the community that Paul is writing to need to be careful not to have either a higher view or a lower view of the state as servants of God. They can't have a higher view than is right. In other words, they shouldn't revere the state. They shouldn't worship Caesar, which in a short time was going to be required of them. That's a too high a view of the state. But you can't have too low a view of the state as antithetical to God. So there's this delicate balancing act, which is complicated, frankly, by the book of Revelation, right? Revelation chapter 13 and Romans chapter 13 are in this kind of weird dialogue with one another. Romans 13 is, the state is good, it's ordained by God. Revelation chapter 13 is the state is this demonic beast that is opposed to God. And both are true. And we have to learn to live in that tension. Let's take a real quick look. We're running out of time here, but at Romans chapter 5, Paul says, "Therefore one must be in subjection not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience." See, these words on your screen, I don't know how big they are on your screen. On my screen, they're really small, so I have a tough time reading them at times. Giving myself an excuse here. There's a double appeal here by Paul. First appeal is to self-interest. If you want to avoid God's wrath, then be in subjection to those ruling authorities that are over you. Not only avoid God's wrath, but avoid the magistrate's wrath, right? Avoid the governor's wrath. But there's this second motivation for the sake of conscience. In other words, don't do it just because it's self-serving, but also do it because it's your duty before God. Even if you get away with a crime, even if you get away with your subversive activities, it's not right. You might escape the governor's wrath, but you've wounded your conscience and you still stand in danger of God's wrath and punishment. Verse 5, real quick, verses 6 and 7 bring this section to a close. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attempting to do this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. Verse 6 is a real practical matter. If these are God's appointed authorities, then you owe them your taxes because they need the resources to perform the duties to which God has called them to perform. Now remember, again, who Paul is writing about here. He's writing about Rome, who was at times demanding oppressive taxes and using them to further their wars on frontiers and to build their military and to erect pagan temples to Caesars. But still, Paul doesn't give us the out of if we like what the taxes are used for, then pay your taxes. But if you don't like how the taxes are used, then don't bother. He doesn't give us that out here. Pay your taxes. For these are ministers of God. That word is different than the word he used earlier, servant. This is the same word that Paul uses to describe himself as a minister of Christ and a minister of the gospel. So there's a parallel in these two kingdoms between pastors, apostles, elders, ministers in the church, and ministers in the secular realm. Both are due respect and honor, not veneration, not worship. Don't give them too much. But verse 7 is in essence a summary of Jesus' phrase, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. That's all the time we have to wrestle with this passage. I am considering doing a whole ACG, adult community group here at church on church and state and political theology. If I'm brave enough, I might. Though if I'm wise enough, I probably won't. We'll see where the dice lands on that. There's so much we didn't get to wrestle with, which I would love to, especially if we were in person. For example, how does this apply to a liberal democracy when the government rules by the consent of we the people? That complicates things a little bit, as opposed to talking about kings and Caesars. What does that look like? We didn't talk about protests, right? Peaceful protests that are legal and protected by our Constitution, and the legitimate ways of voicing concern and calling for justice and reform and change. How can Christians engage in those things? Or revolutionary movements, right? To overthrow governments. We didn't talk about, and if you want my opinion, text me, email me, whatever. We didn't talk about coming off the heels of July 4th, whether or not the Revolutionary War was theologically justifiable. So I'm not going to air that one. You got to ask me in private on that. But I enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for those who were engaging. I will have to check out. I've never watched The Crown. I'll have to check that out at some point. Amanda, you're right. Theocracy, a good example of that is the Pope's ruling in most of Italy through the good part of the 1800s. Thank you guys for your engagement. If you have further questions, feel free to shoot me an email and or leave comments, and I'll try to engage with those later. Hope you have a good day, and God bless.